Picture this. It's 1880. You're walking through the streets of London. The air smells like coal, horse manure, and fried food. Around you, thousands of people are rushing somewhere. And they're not going to church. They're not going to the theater. They're going to see a man with no arms write his name with his feet. They're going to stare at a woman covered head to toe in thick black hair. They're going to pay 1 penny, just 1 penny, to look at another human being and call it entertainment. This wasn't considered cruel. This wasn't considered wrong. This was one of the most popular forms of entertainment in the entire Victorian era. And tonight, we're going to find out exactly why. Welcome back. Today we're talking about Victorian freak shows, what they really were, how they started, who was behind them, and the real reason millions of ordinary, respectable British people developed a dangerous obsession with staring at other human beings. Let's go back to the beginning. Before freak shows became a global phenomenon, there was already a long tradition in England of putting unusual people on display. As far back as the 1600s, fairs across the country would feature so-called curiosities, men and women whose bodies looked different from the norm. A giant here, a dwarf there, someone with an extra limb, someone with no limbs at all. People would pay a small coin to take a look and then move on with their day. It was considered no different from looking at an unusual animal or a strange plant brought back from a faraway land. But in the Victorian era, something changed. Something shifted in British society that turned this occasional curiosity into a full-blown national obsession. And to understand what that was, we need to understand what Britain was going through at the time. The Victorian era began in 1837 when Queen Victoria took the throne, and it lasted until her death in 1901. During those 64 years, Britain went through one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Factories were everywhere. Cities were exploding in size. People who had spent their entire lives working on farms suddenly found themselves crammed into tiny apartments in London, Manchester, and Birmingham, working 14-hour days in hot, dangerous factories. Life was hard. Life was monotonous. Life was exhausting, and people desperately needed an escape. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Victorians didn't have television. They didn't have cinema, not yet anyway. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have any of the distractions we take for granted today. What they had was the street, the fair, the market, and increasingly, they had the freak show for 1 penny, the price of a small loaf of bread. A factory worker could walk into a tent and be completely transported. For 1 hour, he wasn't a tired, poor man with aching hands. He was a spectator. He was an audience member. He was someone looking at the extraordinary. And that feeling was addictive. But it wasn't just the poor who were obsessed. This is one of the most fascinating and disturbing parts of the whole story. Freak shows attracted everyone. Rich merchants, middle-class families, even members of the aristocracy. Because the Victorian freak show wasn't just entertainment. It was something much more complicated than that. Let's talk about the shows themselves. By the middle of the 19th century, freak shows had become highly organized, highly profitable businesses. They weren't just random people standing in a field. They were carefully curated productions with professional managers, elaborate costumes, printed advertisements, and scripted performances. The performers, and yes, they were performers, had stage names, carefully crafted backstories, and sometimes entire fictional biographies invented by their managers to make them seem even more exotic and mysterious. A man with a rare skin condition might be presented as a wild man from Borneo. A woman with hypertrichosis, a condition that causes excessive hair growth all over the body, was introduced as the bearded lady from the jungles of South America. The truth didn't matter. The story did. And the stories were always designed to do one very specific thing: make the audience feel simultaneously repelled and fascinated, scared and safe, superior and curious. This is the psychological key to understanding why freak shows were so popular, and it brings us to the real reason behind their rise. Victorian society was obsessed with classification, with order, with the idea that the world could be divided into categories: normal and abnormal, civilized and savage, British and foreign, healthy and diseased. Charles Darwin had published On the Origin of Species in 1859, and his ideas, often misunderstood and twisted, had given people a new way to think about human difference. Scientists, doctors, and philosophers were constantly debating what a normal human being looked like and what it meant when someone fell outside that definition. The freak show gave ordinary Victorians a way to participate in that debate without having to read a single scientific paper. By looking at someone who was different, someone whose body defied the norm, the audience got to feel, just for a moment, that they understood something about the world, that they were on the right side of the line between normal and abnormal, that they were, in the most fundamental sense, fine. Psychologists today call this downward social comparison. It's the same reason people slow down to look at car accidents. The same reason reality TV is so addictive. By seeing someone who appears to be worse off than you, your brain gets a temporary boost. You feel better about your own situation, your own body, your own life. The Victorians didn't have that language for it, but they felt it, and they kept coming back for more. Now let's talk about the performers themselves, because this is where the story gets truly complex. For a long time, the history of freak shows was told entirely from the audience's perspective. The performers were seen as passive victims, helpless people exploited by greedy showmen. And in many cases, that was absolutely true. There are heartbreaking stories of people who were essentially kidnapped, trafficked, or coerced into performing. People who had no choice. People who were displayed against their will. But the full picture is more complicated than that, because many freak show performers were not victims at all. They were savvy, calculated business people who understood exactly what they were doing and made deliberate choices to profit from the public's curiosity. Take Joseph Merrick. You probably know him as the Elephant Man born in Leicester in 1862. Merrick had a condition that caused severe deformities across his entire body. He had a massive growth on his head, distorted limbs, and skin that hung in thick folds. His life before the freak show was genuinely terrible. He spent time in a workhouse, which was essentially a Victorian prison for the poor, where conditions were brutal and dehumanizing. When Merrick connected with a showman named Tom Norman and began appearing in freak shows, his life actually improved in material terms. He had food, he had shelter, he had money. He had, for the first time, a degree of agency over his own life. He even had regular conversations with his audience, something he reportedly enjoyed. This doesn't make the freak show industry moral. It absolutely doesn't. But it complicates the simple narrative of pure exploitation. The truth is that for some performers, the freak show was the best option available in a society that offered them almost nothing else. And then there were performers who were outright stars, international celebrities, people who earned more money in a single season than most factory workers made in a lifetime. Charles Stratton is perhaps the most famous example. Born in Connecticut in 1838, Stratton had a form of dwarfism that left him just over 3 feet tall as an adult. He was discovered by the legendary American showman P.T. Barnum at the age of 4 and became known to the world as General Tom Thumb. He performed for Queen Victoria herself, not once but 3 times. He wore elaborate costumes, performed songs and comedy routines, and eventually became wealthy enough to own yachts, racehorses, and multiple homes. Was the situation ethically complicated? Absolutely. He was essentially put to work as a small child. But by the time he was an adult, Tom Thumb was making his own choices, negotiating his own contracts, and living a life of genuine luxury. He was by any measure a star. Now, let's come back to Britain, because the British freak show scene had its own very particular flavor. And understanding that flavor tells us something important about Victorian society. American freak shows, particularly those run by P.T. Barnum, tended towards spectacle and showmanship. They were loud, brash, celebratory. Come see the greatest wonders of the world. Everything was the biggest, the smallest, the most extraordinary thing you've ever seen. British freak shows were different. They had a veneer of respectability, of education, of science. The best British freak show promoters didn't just invite you to stare, they invited you to learn, to understand, to participate in the great Victorian project of cataloging and understanding the natural world. Performers weren't just exhibited, they were examined. doctors and scientists would sometimes be present, measuring and observing and writing notes, giving the whole proceedings the atmosphere of a medical lecture rather than a circus. Middle-class Victorians who might have felt uncomfortable paying to simply gawk at another person had no trouble at all paying to attend what was framed as an educational experience. This was genius marketing, and it worked brilliantly. By the 1880s, London's West End was packed with what were called exhibition rooms, essentially upscale freak shows that catered to wealthy audiences. Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly was perhaps the most famous. It hosted hundreds of exhibitions over the decades, presenting everyone from living skeletons to conjoined twins to people with rare neurological conditions, all in an atmosphere of tasteful curiosity rather than cheap sensation. The more fashionable the venue, the higher the ticket price, and the more the audience could congratulate themselves on their refined interest in human science. They weren't gawkers. They were observers, students of humanity. The distinction was entirely fictional, of course, but it mattered enormously to the Victorians, who were deeply concerned with maintaining the appearance of respectability no matter what they were actually doing. Now here's something that very few people talk about when they discuss Victorian freak shows: the role of race. Many of the most popular exhibitions of the era weren't just about physical difference. They were about racial difference. Promoters would bring people from Africa, Asia, and the Americas and display them as living examples of primitive humanity. These exhibitions were deeply racist by any modern standard, presenting non-European people as curiosities to be observed rather than human beings to be respected. One of the most disturbing examples is the case of Sarji Bartman, a South African woman who was brought to London in 1810, slightly before our main period, but her case shaped everything that came after. She was displayed across Europe under the name the Hottentot Venus, exhibited for her physical features in shows that attracted enormous crowds. After her death, her body was dissected and her remains were displayed in a Paris museum for over a century. Her story is a reminder that for all the complexity we might find in the freak show story, for all the performers who exercised genuine agency and made real money, the industry was built on a foundation of exploitation. And that exploitation fell hardest on those who were already most vulnerable: people of color, people with disabilities, people who had no legal protections and no recourse when they were mistreated. By the 1890s, the golden age of the Victorian freak show was beginning to fade. Several forces were working against it simultaneously. First, there was the rise of new forms of entertainment. Music halls have been growing in popularity throughout the century, offering a different kind of spectacle, one based on performance and talent rather than physical difference. And in 1895, the Lumiere brothers held the first public film screening in Paris. Within years, cinema had arrived in Britain, and it offered something no freak show ever could: the illusion of total immersion in another world. Second, there was a genuine shift in public attitudes. The medical establishment, which had once lent freak shows an air of scientific legitimacy, began to distance itself. Conditions that had once been presented as exotic mysteries were increasingly understood as medical diagnoses. And as medical understanding grew, the spectacle of displaying sick or disabled people began to feel less like education and more like cruelty. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the law began to change. A series of regulations throughout the late Victorian and Edwardian periods placed new restrictions on public exhibitions, protecting vulnerable people from exploitation and limiting the kinds of shows that could legally operate. By the early 20th century, the classic Victorian freak show was effectively finished in Britain. It limped on in various forms in America for a few more decades. You could still find genuine freak shows at American carnivals as late as the 1970s. But the British version, with its peculiar blend of scientific pretension and popular entertainment, was gone. So what do we make of all this? What does the rise and fall of the Victorian freak show actually tell us? I think it tells us something uncomfortable but important about human nature. The impulse that drove millions of respectable Victorians to pay their penny and file into a tent to stare at another human being. That impulse didn't disappear when the freak shows closed. It has found new outlets. We watch reality television that humiliates contestants. We follow social media accounts that document people's most embarrassing moments. We click on news stories about people whose lives have fallen apart. We slow down when we drive past accidents. We are still, in ways we don't always like to admit, fascinated by human difference and human suffering. The Victorians didn't invent that impulse, and we haven't eliminated it. What changes over time is not the impulse itself, but the forms it takes and the social rules that govern when it's acceptable to indulge it. The real reason behind the rise of Victorian freak shows wasn't cruelty. It wasn't ignorance. It was something much more fundamental. The very human need to look at something extraordinary, to feel something powerful, and to walk away reassured that your own life, with all its difficulties and disappointments, is somehow normal. The tent is gone, but the impulse remains. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, make sure you subscribe because we have a lot more Victorian history coming very soon. And let me know in the comments, which part of this story surprised you the most?